At 2 o'clock in the morning, in a hallway that smelled like lavender laid over something the lavender could not cover, a dying woman I had spoken to exactly twice lifted one finger at me out of the dark and told me to go home. She said it the way you'd tell a man his house was on fire, quiet, certain, without any interest at all in being polite about it. "Whatever your nephew tells you when he gets here," she said, "don't believe a word of it, don't sign anything. Drive home tonight if you can." I want to be honest with you about what I did with that warning, because the whole story turns on it. I thanked her. I told her I appreciated her concern. And then I walked back into my brother's room, sat down in the dark beside the bed where he was dying, and decided she was a lonely old woman with a bad family of her own, projecting her grief onto mine. That was the single most expensive thought I have ever had in my life. It very nearly cost me my brother's last wishes, my niece's inheritance, and whatever it is inside a man that lets him look at himself in a mirror while he shaves. Before I take you any further into that hallway, let me say thank you for being here with me. If you've got a second, tell me down in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. I read every one of them. It matters to me more than you'd guess, and I'll tell you why by the end of this. Some details have been changed, names a few places, the shape of certain rooms. The heart of it hasn't been touched. Not 1 inch of it. My name is Walter Merriam. I'm 63 years old, and for 38 years I dispatched freight for a regional trucking outfit out of northern Arizona before I retired 3 summers ago. I balanced my checkbook every Sunday morning of my adult life, at the same kitchen table, with the same felt tip pen. I read the fine print on everything. My wife Diane used to stand at the gas pump laughing at me because I'd spend 20 minutes deciding whether the car wash was worth the extra $4. I tell you all that so you'll understand the man who walked into that hospice, careful with strangers, trusting with family. And I thought, God help me, I thought that combination was wisdom. It's not wisdom. It's the exact shape of the hole they come through. Diane had been gone almost 2 years when the call came about my brother. It was Paige who called, my niece, Russell's daughter, on a Tuesday afternoon in late October while I was out back trying to convince a swamp cooler to live one more season. She said the word hospice, and then she stopped talking, and I stood there holding a wrench I no longer remembered picking up. I didn't pack a proper bag. 3 shirts and a toothbrush went into a duffel, and I was on Interstate 15 before the sun went down, driving 11 hours from Flagstaff to Missoula, Montana, through country so dark and so empty that for long stretches the only thing in the world was my headlights and the white line and the sound of my own breathing. My brother's name was Russell Merriam. He was 4 years older than me, and he raised me more than our father ever did. When our old man walked out in the spring of 1968, Russell was 12 and I was 8. And from that afternoon forward, he was the one who taught me how to throw a curveball, how to hold a razor, how to apologize to a girl without making excuses in the middle of it. He was the steadiest man I ever knew. He spent his whole life as an iron worker, up on steel in weather that would kill you. And he never once in 50 years told me he was afraid of anything. By the time I got to Missoula, he weighed about 90 pounds. Pancreatic cancer. His hands shook so badly, he couldn't hold the paper cup of ice chips the nurse brought in, so I held it for him. And I fed him chips off a plastic spoon like he'd done for me when I had scarlet fever in 1970. But his mind was sharp. That's the part I want you to hold on to. His body was leaving him a piece at a time, but the man inside was still all the way there. And the very first thing he did when I came through that door, before hello, before anything, was grab my wrist with what strength he had left and pull me down close to his face. "Where's the boy?" he said. "Where's Nolan? Have you seen him yet?" Nolan Kessler is my nephew, Russell's only son. 41 years old, lived up in Billings, worked in commercial insurance or something adjacent to it that I never fully understood and never thought hard enough about. He'd taken his mother's maiden name in his 20s, after a falling out with Russell that everyone in the family had agreed by silent vote never to discuss again. I told my brother that no, I hadn't seen Nolan, that the nurse said he'd be down in the morning. Russell nodded. But here's the thing. He didn't look relieved. A dying man hearing his only son is coming should look relieved. He looked tired, the kind of tired that goes past the body and into whatever is underneath the body. I didn't know what that look meant. I know now. The room directly across the hall from my brother's belonged to a woman in a wheelchair with a quilt over her knees. Her name, I learned later from a nurse, was Adeline Whitcomb. Late 70s, maybe 80. Stage 4 something I never asked, and she never offered. She had a daughter, who came exactly once, on a Sunday afternoon, with a paper sack of clean nightgowns, and who left after 20 minutes without taking her coat off. Other than that, nobody. Not a card. Not a phone call I ever heard through those thin walls. I'd see her sometimes in the common room when I went to walk the stiffness out of my legs, sitting by the window doing the crossword. In pen. I remember noticing that and thinking, there's a woman who's been sure of herself for a long time. I felt sorry for her, the way you feel sorry for anyone alone at the end of something. That's an easy feeling. It costs you nothing. It's practically a hobby, feeling sorry for people. The first afternoon I walked past her door, I said hello, and she nodded and didn't speak. The second day, I brought her one of the muffins the volunteers stocked in the family kitchen, and she took it and said, "Thank you, very correct, very polite." And that was the entire transaction. It was the third night that something changed. I'd been sitting beside Russell for hours, holding his hand while he slept, listening to the oxygen concentrator click and hiss, and the wind come down off the mountains against the window glass. Around midnight, I stepped out to walk the hall and get my head above water. And as I passed Adeline Whitcomb's room, I saw she was awake, sitting up in her chair with the lamp turned down low. She looked at me and said, "Your brother's dying." Not unkindly, not as a question, just a fact set down on the table between us. I stopped. "Yes, ma'am, he is. He's worried about something," she said. "He talks in his sleep. The nurses come and go and they don't listen. But I hear him through the wall. I'm awake anyway." I didn't think much of it. Men talk in their sleep, especially on morphine. I told her I appreciated her keeping him company in her own way, and I went back in and sat down. The next night was different. It was past 2 in the morning. I was wrung out. I hadn't slept more than 3 hours in a stretch since I'd arrived. The night nurse needed to change Russell's line, so I stepped out and started down the hall toward the coffee machine. And I saw that Adeline Whitcomb's door was open, and she was sitting in her wheelchair right in the doorway. Not moving, just watching the hallway. Like a woman who'd been waiting for a train she knew was late. She lifted one finger at me. That small gesture that means, "Come here and don't make noise doing it." I walked over, she said, "Sit down a minute." I pulled the visitor's chair over from beside her bed and sat. She had pale gray eyes, very clear, and she looked at me a long time before she said anything else. Long enough that I got uncomfortable. "Your nephew gets in tomorrow," she said. I said, "Yes." And then, "How would you know that?" "Because your brother told a nurse last night, when he was half out of himself. He said the boy was coming, and he was afraid of what the boy was going to do. He said it 3 times, Mr. Merriam. He kept saying he should have changed the will. He kept saying it." She let that sit. The nurse patted his hand and went on with her rounds, but I heard him. I felt something go down my spine, like cold water finding a channel. I asked her what she meant by that. She said, "I had a son once. He's the reason I'm in this room by myself." And then she leaned forward and her voice dropped, and she said the thing I have not been able to unhear in the years since. "Whatever your nephew tells you tomorrow, don't believe a word of it. Don't sign anything. Don't agree to anything. Not one thing. Drive home tonight if you can. I mean it." I didn't know what to do with that, so I did what people do. I thanked her. I told her I appreciated her concern, and I went back into my brother's room and sat in the dark and told myself a story about a sad old woman with a broken family who was seeing her own son's face on every man who walked past her door. Nolan was my nephew. I'd held him the day he came home from the hospital. I'd taught him to bait a hook on a lake in Idaho when he was 7 years old, and he cried because the worm moved. The idea that he was flying down here to do something crooked at his own father's deathbed, it didn't compute. It wasn't that I rejected it. It's that there was no place in me for the thought to land. I dismissed her. That was my first mistake, and it was not my worst one. My worst one was 30 years old by then, and I'd been making it every single day without noticing. Nolan showed up around 11 the next morning. He came through the door of that hospice room in a charcoal gray jacket, no tie, hair gone a little salt and pepper at the temples, and he hugged me before he even looked at his father, lying in the bed 6 feet away. I want you to sit with that for a second, because I didn't at the time. His father was dying in the room, and the first body my nephew went to was mine. He smelled like aftershave and airport coffee. He said, "Uncle Walt, I'm so sorry." I got here as fast as I could, and he held on a beat longer than felt natural. A beat and a half. I noticed it. I dismissed that too. I was getting good at dismissing things that week. I'd had 30 years of practice. Because here's what I hadn't let myself remember until much later, sitting in my truck in a parking lot in Montana with my hands shaking. 8 years before that hospice room, Nolan had called me on a Thursday night and asked me for $11,000. He'd said it was a bridge, that was his word. Bridge, on a commercial property he was going in on with two partners in Billings. He'd said 90 days. He'd been so specific about the 90 days that the specificity itself had reassured me. Diane had asked me one question about it. One. She'd said, "Walter, if it's such a sure thing, why isn't a bank doing it?" And I had gotten irritated with my wife. I remember the irritation. I remember thinking she was being small about family. I never saw the 11,000 again. Nolan never mentioned it again. And neither did I, because bringing it up would have been awkward. And because he was Russell's boy. And because $11,000 was not going to change my life. And because, and this is the true reason, the one underneath all the others, because if I'd made him answer for it, I would have had to find out what he was. And I did not want to find out what he was. It was easier to lose the money. That's not generosity. I called it generosity for 8 years. It was cowardice wearing generosity's coat, and I paid for the rental every day without knowing it. So Nolan sat by Russell's bed that morning for about 10 minutes and said all the right things. He held his father's hand. He talked low in that voice people use in rooms like that. Russell was awake but barely tracking, drifting in and out on the morphine tide. And at one point Russell turned his head on the pillow and looked at me. Not at his son, at me. And his eyes were wet, and he opened his mouth like he was going to say something. And then, I watched him do it, he closed it again. I will go to my own grave seeing that. My brother, who taught me how to be a man, looking at me with his mouth open, and then choosing to close it. He didn't have the strength to fight, and he knew he didn't, and so he was trying to hand me something with his eyes alone. After about an hour, Nolan said, "Uncle Walt, can we step out and talk?" About arrangements, about after. We went down to the cafeteria, just the two of us. He bought us both coffee. He sat across from me and laid his hands flat on the table, palms down like a man about to conduct business. "Dad's been worrying about the house," he said. "The one up in Whitefish. That was the cabin. Russell built it with his own 2 hands across 4 summers in the late 70s, on a piece of lakefront he'd bought for almost nothing back when nobody wanted it. He'd lived in it alone since Louise passed in 2015. By my rough guess, it was worth somewhere north of $700,000 now. He'd hung the door himself. I'd helped him carry the beams. He wants me to handle the transfer, Nolan said. The thing is, Uncle, he's not going to make it through the week. Probably not the next 48 hours, the doctor told me this morning. And there's paperwork that needs his signature while he's still lucid. Otherwise, it all goes to probate, and probate turns into a 2-year mess that eats half the value in legal fees. You know how that goes. I nodded slowly. I did know how that went. I'd watched a buddy of mine lose better than half his mother's estate to attorneys because she passed without her documents in order. Nolan knew I'd watched that happen. I'd told him the story myself years ago at a Christmas table, while he listened with his chin on his hand looking very interested. I understand now that he was not being sympathetic that day. He was taking inventory. Dad asked me last week, before I flew out the first time, to have a quitclaim drawn up, he said. Just to keep things clean. He wants the cabin signed over to me directly so I can deal with it after. Sell it if I need to, cover his final expenses. And whatever's left goes into the family. But he can barely hold a pen now. So we'll need a notary this afternoon, and we'll need a witness. He turned his coffee cup a quarter turn on the table. That's where you come in. He had the calmest, cleanest, most practical face on him. Like a man discussing an oil change, I said, "What about your sister, Paige, my niece?" She lived down in Eugene, Oregon, taught at a community college, had 2 kids. She and Nolan had never been close. Not estranged exactly, just tectonically separate. 2 plates that had drifted apart, so gradually nobody noticed the ocean between them. I hadn't seen her in 5 years myself. That's a thing I'm ashamed of now. Paige isn't in the will for the cabin, Nolan said. Mom and Dad set that up years ago. The Whitefish place was always supposed to come to me. Paige got the life insurance and the savings. It was all worked out a long time ago. This is just paperwork. He said it so smoothly. All worked out a long time ago. Just paperwork, I said. I'd like to see what your father had drawn up. And Nolan smiled, just a little, just at one corner of his mouth. Uncle Walt, of course, he said. It's in my bag upstairs. But honestly, I'd hate to put you through reading legal documents in the middle of all this. You're grieving. Let me handle it. You just sign as a witness this afternoon when the notary comes. And that's when I heard her. Don't sign anything. 2 o'clock in the morning, in the dark, a woman with pale gray eyes who owed me nothing. I heard her the way you hear a smoke alarm through a wall, muffled, easy to ignore, impossible to unnotice once you have. I said, I'd still like to see it. I'll come by your hotel after dinner, and we'll go through it together. His face shifted. Half a second. The smile stayed exactly where it was. That's the part that frightens me still, that the smile never moved, but behind his eyes something closed. A door, somewhere down a long hallway, swinging shut. Sure, Uncle Walt, he said. Whatever makes you comfortable. I went back upstairs. Russell was asleep. I sat beside him a long while just looking at his face, the face that had been the first thing I looked for in every room of my childhood. And I thought about the woman across the hall, and I thought about my nephew's mouth staying smiling, while something behind his eyes shut a door. There was a nurse on that floor named Marlene Boyd, 50-some, gray braid down her back, the kind of woman who's seen 10,000 people die and has not gotten cold about it, which I consider one of the harder achievements available to a human being. She came in around 2 to check Russell's line, and she did something I didn't understand at the time. She lingered. She fussed with things that didn't need fussing with. She smoothed a blanket that was already smooth, and on her way out she stopped in the doorway with her hand on the frame and said, Not looking at me, your nephew was here in September, wasn't he? I said he had been for 2 days. She said, and then she left. That was it. That was the whole thing. 4 words and a sound. I found out 3 weeks later what she'd almost said. In September, Nolan had cornered her at the nurse's station and asked her a series of questions that had nothing to do with his father's comfort and everything to do with his father's competence. What paperwork does a person sign in here? Who witnesses it? If someone's on morphine, does that invalidate a signature? He'd framed it all as concern. She'd answered him because it was her job to answer families, and she'd walked away from that conversation with a feeling in her stomach she couldn't name. And she didn't tell anybody. For 6 weeks, she didn't tell anybody. When I finally asked her about it, months later, over coffee in a diner in Missoula, she said the thing I have now heard, in one form or another, from more people than I can count. She said, It wasn't my place. I want to come back to that phrase. It's the most expensive sentence in the English language. But I need to finish telling you about that afternoon first. Sitting there beside Russell, I found myself doing something I hadn't done in years, which was remembering Nolan as a boy. Not the fishing trip, that one's easy, that one's a postcard. I mean the year Louise died. Nolan was 14. And Russell, who was the steadiest man I ever knew, and the worst man alive at sitting still in a room with his own grief, went back up on steel 11 days after his wife's funeral, and stayed up there for the better part of 4 years. He didn't abandon that boy. I want to be fair to my brother, who can't defend himself now. He never abandoned him. He sent money. God, did he send money. A check for a car at 16. A check for the deposit on an apartment. A check when there was trouble at school. And later a check when there was trouble with a girl's family. And later a check when there was trouble with a business partner in Coeur d'Alene that nobody ever explained to me. I was at Russell's table the night Nolan turned 16. Russell was in Great Falls on a job. He'd mailed a check and it came in a plain envelope with no card, because Russell Merriam did not know how to buy a card. And that boy opened the envelope at the table and looked at the check, and his face did nothing. Absolutely nothing. He said, "Cool," and put it in his pocket and asked if there was more cake. I remember being relieved. I remember thinking, well, he's taking it well. He wasn't taking it well. He was learning the exchange rate. He was learning at 16 at the kitchen table that in this family love arrived as a number, and that the number came whether or not you'd earned it, and that nobody was ever going to ask you a hard question as long as you said thank you and put it in your pocket. Small kindnesses, when they're really avoidance dressed up in better clothes, plant seeds. And seeds don't care how good your intentions were. They come up anyway. They come up in a hospice room 25 years later, with a notary standing in the hall. Around 4 o'clock that afternoon, a man in a brown suit came down the corridor, carrying a leather briefcase, and asked, At the nurse's station for Nolan Kessler. Nolan came out of the room smiling and shook his hand like they were old friends meeting for lunch. The two of them started into my brother's room together. I stood up out of my chair. I said, "I'm coming in too." "Of course, Uncle Walt," Nolan said. "Come on. We need your signature anyway, as the witness." I walked into my brother's room. The notary had a stack of papers laid out on a little folding tray they'd swung over Russell's bed, the same tray they brought his applesauce on. Russell was awake, but his eyes were glassy, and he kept looking from me to Nolan and back, the way a man looks when he's trying to remember something urgent through 6 feet of water. The notary had already started explaining the documents in the flat bored voice of a man who has done this 1,100 times and has a dinner reservation. I asked if I could see the papers. He handed me the top one, quitclaim deed, transferring the property in Whitefish, Montana, to Nolan Kessler. That much was exactly what my nephew had told me at the cafeteria table. That much was true. But there was a second document underneath it, and underneath that, a third. The second was a durable power of attorney, effective immediately, making Nolan sole agent over every financial affair my brother had in this world. The third was a change of beneficiary form on a life insurance policy through Russell's old ironworkers local. $400,000. A policy I had not known existed, and the beneficiary line had been freshly typed with Nolan's name, over top of a line where, on the carbon underneath, you could still read the shape of the name that had been there before. Page. I stood in that room holding those 3 pieces of paper, and the whole world went very quiet and very slow, the way it does right before a car accident, when you can see the other vehicle coming, and you have all the time in the world, and none of it is any use to you. I said, "Nolan, what are these other 2? He didn't miss a step." "Oh, those are just protective measures. In case Dad's situation changes, and someone needs to handle his affairs over the next few days." I said, "Your father is going to pass in a matter of days. The doctor told you that this morning. You told me so yourself at that table downstairs." I held up the second page. "So why does he need a power of attorney?" "Uncle Walt, please, now isn't the time." I held up the third page. "Why is the life insurance changed?" Paige agreed to that, and I said, "Did she?" And his face did the door closing thing again. The notary, and I have thought about this man many times since. And I hope he's well. The notary was looking back and forth between us, like a fellow who has just realized his afternoon has taken a turn he was not staffed for. I said, "I'd like a few minutes alone with my brother and my nephew." He nodded fast and got out into the hall. I closed the door behind him. "I want to tell you about the 10 seconds after that door clicked shut, because those 10 seconds are the whole story, and everything else is just scaffolding around them." I had my phone in my hand. I had my niece's number on the screen, and I could not press it. Here is what was going through me. If I press this, and I'm wrong, if there's an innocent explanation, if Russell really did ask for all 3 of these, if I am just an exhausted 63-year-old man who let a dying stranger get into his head at 2 in the morning, then I have accused my brother's only son of trying to rob his father on his deathbed, in front of his father, in the last hours his father has, and there is no coming back from that. Not for me. Not for this family. I would be the man who did that, forever. And underneath that, quieter and uglier, was the real thing. The real thing was not fear of being wrong. The real thing was, if I press this, I find out. 30 years of not finding out was standing in the room with me, and it was speaking in a very reasonable voice. And what it was saying was, "Walter, you don't have to know this. You can put the phone down. You can sign as a witness, drive home to Flagstaff, and go on being a man with a nephew. I have never in my life wanted anything the way I wanted to put that phone down." I looked at my brother. Russell was watching me from the bed. 90 pounds of a man who had once carried a beam across open steel 40 feet up in a wind. He couldn't speak. He couldn't lift his arm. He had nothing left in this world but his eyes, and his eyes were on me, and they were not confused. He was begging me. I pressed the number. She picked up on the second ring, and I had already put her on speaker. "Paige," I said. "It's Uncle Walter. I'm at the hospice with your father and your brother and a notary." Nolan was already moving toward me. "Did you agree to be taken off as the beneficiary on your father's life insurance through the ironworkers?" There was a pause. 3 seconds, maybe. In that pause I could hear a child's voice somewhere behind her and a television. Then she said very slowly, "I'm sorry, Uncle Walter, what? Did you agree to it? I don't know what you're talking about. What life insurance policy?" Nolan was talking now. Fast, over the top of us both. Paige, hi. Listen, this is a misunderstanding. These are protective documents. This is standard. This is what you do when. And my niece, who I had not spoken to in 5 years, whose kids I had never met, said in a voice I have never forgotten. Nolan, what did you do? Paige, calm down. Uncle Walter. Her voice changed. It went flat and hard and clear, and I understood in that instant that she was not surprised. Not truly. She was horrified, but she was not surprised, and there is an ocean between those two things. Uncle Walter, don't sign anything. Do you hear me? Don't sign one thing. I'm getting on a plane tonight. I hung up. The room was so quiet I could hear the concentrator clicking. I could hear my brother breathing. Nolan turned to me, and the mask came off, and I want to describe what was under it, because I've had 4 years to find the words, and I still don't have good ones. He wasn't ashamed, that's the thing. There was no shame anywhere in that face. He was recalculating. His eyes moved over me the way a man's eyes move over a broken machine he's deciding whether to repair or replace. Uncle Walt, he said, and his voice was perfectly reasonable. You don't understand the financial situation here. Dad owes money. Dad owes money to me. I have been carrying things in this family for years. I have been the one who, do you have any idea what I've put in? I deserve, I said. Get out. Uncle, get out of this room. He stared at me a long moment. And the boy who cried over a worm on a lake in Idaho was not in that face. There was somebody else looking out through my nephew's eyes. Somebody patient. Somebody who was already 3 moves down a different road, already drafting the email he'd send me in a month. He picked up his briefcase. He gathered the documents off the bed tray, all 3 careful, squaring the edges, the way you'd tidy a desk. And he walked out of his father's room, without saying one word to his father. Without looking at him. His father was 6 feet away, awake and dying, and Nolan Kessler walked out of that room and did not look at him. I sat down on the edge of the bed. I took Russell's hand. He was crying. No sound at all. He didn't have the air for sound. Just tears running sideways down into the pillow. I said, "It's all right, Russ. It's all right." I stopped it, and he squeezed my hand. Once. That was the last conversation I ever had with my brother, and it was 2 words long and one of us didn't speak. Paige landed at 11:40 that night. I picked her up at the airport in Missoula, and she was crying before she got to the truck. Russell passed 31 hours later, on a Wednesday morning just before sunrise, with his daughter holding one hand and me holding the other. Nolan was not there. He was, we found out afterward, at that point already in Billings, meeting with a man about a different property. The week after the funeral, Paige and I sat down in Whitefish with my brother's actual attorney, a woman named Harriet Doyle, who had handled Russell's affairs for 20 years, and who had never once been contacted by Nolan Kessler about any of this. She pulled the real will. The cabin in Whitefish was to be sold, and the proceeds split 50-50 between Nolan and Paige. The life insurance, all $400,000, was Paige's, and had been since the day it was written. The savings, about $86,000, were to be divided 3 ways, with the last third going to a scholarship at the Northwestern Trade and Technical Institute, where my brother had done his apprenticeship in 1972. He'd never told anybody about that scholarship, not me, not his kids. He'd set it up quietly in 2018 and never mentioned it, because that was the man. Those 3 documents in that hospice room would have flipped nearly every provision of it. The cabin would have been Nolan's outright. The insurance would have been Nolan's. And with that power of attorney, effective immediately, in the 31 hours my brother had left on this earth, Nolan could have emptied the savings before the will was ever read. Harriet Doyle looked across her desk at me and said, "Do you understand what would have happened if you'd signed those papers?" I said, "I do now." And she said, "Where did you get the instinct to question it?" And I sat in that chair in Montana, and I couldn't answer her for a second, because the honest answer was that I didn't have the instinct. I've never had the instinct. I was walking straight toward that table with a pen in my hand. I said, "A woman in a wheelchair told me not to." I drove back down to Missoula that Saturday to find her. I'd brought a box of pastries from a bakery Harriet had recommended and a card I'd written out by hand 4 times, because the first 3 tries weren't good enough, and the 4th one wasn't either, but I ran out of cards. The nurse at the front desk recognized me, and I watched her face change when I said who I'd come to see. Adeline Whitcomb had passed on Thursday, 2 days before, quietly in her sleep. Her daughter hadn't been in yet to clear the room. The nurse asked if I'd been close to her. I said, "No, ma'am, I met her twice. But she did something for me I'm never going to be able to pay back." The nurse was quiet a moment. Then she said, "Did she give you a piece of paper?" I said no. She said, "Wait here." She came back with an envelope. My name was on the front in a shaky, slanted hand. "Mr. Merriam." "She left it at the desk on Wednesday morning," the nurse said. "She told us, if he comes back, give it to him. If he doesn't come back, throw it away. If he doesn't come back, throw it away." She was going to let it go. She had done the whole thing. The waiting in the dark, the finger lifted in a hallway. At 2 in the morning, the one warning she had left in her. And she was prepared to have it come to nothing, and never know. That's not heroism. Heroism has an audience. That's something else. I don't have a name for it. I took the envelope outside and sat down on a bench in the November cold and opened it. One sheet of paper folded once. The handwriting was thin and it slanted downhill. "Mr. Merriam, I don't know if you listened to me. I hope you did. My son's name was Everett. In the spring of 2009, he took everything I had. The house, the savings, my husband's rings. I never saw any of it again. He doesn't call me anymore. There's nothing left to take. The reason I'm telling you is not the losing. I've made my peace with the losing. I have spent 15 years in beds like this one, in apartments smaller than this room, in places I never once imagined I would end up, and I can tell you the losing is not the worst part. The worst part is that nobody warned me. Not one person. I had a sister-in-law who knew whatever it was. She told me afterward when I asked her that she'd suspected it for years. I asked her why she never said anything. She said it wasn't her place. That was the day I decided that if I ever again saw a thing like that happening to somebody else, I would say something. It would be my place. I would make it my place. There is one more thing and then I'll stop. The night I heard your brother through the wall, calling out about the boy and the will, I was not thinking about your brother. I was thinking about the last night in my own house. Everett stood by my bed at 11 o'clock at night with papers in his hand and told me it had to be tonight, that the man was waiting, that I was tired and shouldn't trouble myself reading it. I signed them because he was my son, and because I was tired, and because I did not want to be the kind of mother who asks her son for proof. I have had 15 years to be that kind of mother instead. I recommend the other one, so I said something to you. Whatever happened, I hope you're safe. Sincerely, Adeline Whitcomb. I sat on that bench for I don't know how long. It was cold and I didn't feel it. A nurse came out at one point and asked if I was all right, and I said, "Yes, ma'am. I'm just going to sit here a little while." It wasn't her place and she said something anyway. That's what saved me. That's what saved my brother's last wishes. That's what kept my niece from being robbed of $500,000 by her own brother in the worst week of her life. She was dying. She had every reason on God's earth to roll over in that bed and let me walk past her open door. And she didn't. Nolan tried to call me twice in the month after the funeral. I didn't pick up. Then came the email. 600 words about misunderstandings. About how I'd humiliated him in front of a notary. About how I'd let a stranger poison me against my own blood. He wrote that our family was broken now and that it was my fault. He wrote that his father would have wanted us to stay together. That last line is the one I want you to notice. His father would have wanted us to stay together. He was still using Russell. Russell was in the ground, and Nolan was still reaching into that grave for leverage. I read it once. I deleted it. Paige, though. Paige I talk to nearly every Sunday now. She came down to Flagstaff for Easter that first year and brought her 2 kids, and we went up to the canyon and ate green child cheeseburgers at a place I used to go with Diane. And her oldest, she's 11, drew me a Roadrunner that is on my refrigerator as I speak to you. I'd let 5 years go by without calling that girl. 5 years. Because it was awkward, and because there'd been a thing at a wedding once, and because I told myself she had her own life. 5 years I could have had with my brother's daughter, thrown away for no reason, I can now reconstruct. That's another thing avoidance costs you. It doesn't just cost you the disasters, it costs you the Roadrunner on the refrigerator. About 6 months after Russell passed, a letter came to my house in Flagstaff, from a woman in Billings I'd never heard of. Her father had died in May. She'd been his executor. And going through his desk, she'd found a notebook in his handwriting where he had written down in a column the names of the people who had cheated him. He'd kept a list. An 81-year-old man had kept a private list of his own humiliations in a drawer and never told a soul. One of the names on it was Nolan Kessler. $47,000 borrowed and never repaid. She'd found my name through the obituary I'd helped Paige write, and she wanted to know whether there was a process for filing a claim against my brother's estate. I called her back. We talked for an hour and 10 minutes. Her name was Corinne Ashby, 68, a widow, a retired school librarian. And her father, she said, had been the kind of man who would never tell his children he was being cheated because he was ashamed. Ashamed. He was the one being robbed, and he was the one carrying the shame. And he carried it right into the ground with him. And his daughter only found out because she opened a drawer. I want to say that again. He was ashamed. That is the machine. That is the whole machine right there. Everett Whitcomb, Nolan Kessler, all of them, they don't run on greed. Greed's just the fuel. The machine runs on our shame. It runs on the fact that a decent old man would rather lose $47,000 than have his daughter know he'd been fooled. It runs on a woman not telling her sister-in-law because it isn't her place. It runs on a nurse with a bad feeling in her stomach keeping it to herself for 6 weeks. It runs on an uncle writing off $11,000 because asking the question would have been awkward at Christmas. We build these men. We build them out of our own politeness, and then we act surprised. I didn't sit on that letter. I called Paige that night, and Paige called Harriet Doyle. And Harriet, who is 64 years old, and I have come to believe, one of the more dangerous people in the state of Montana, started pulling threads. What came out over the following year was this. Nolan had been doing it for a long time, not just to family, to clients, to his father's old friends from the local, to anyone who would let him near a checkbook and then be too embarrassed to say so. He was carrying about $300,000 in unsecured debt, 2 pending civil suits in Washington, and a gambling problem that not one person in our family had known about, or more accurately, that not one person in our family had wanted to know about, which is a different sentence entirely. The cabin scheme at the hospice, we eventually understood, was not the beginning of anything. It was the last roll of the dice. If he had gotten that property, he could have leveraged it inside a week and stayed ahead of his creditors for another 6 months. My brother's 4 summers of work, his own hands, his own door, 6 months of float. He went to trial 19 months after Russell died. Not for what he tried to do in that hospice room. That would have been almost impossible to prove, an attempt witnessed by an uncle and a dying man who couldn't testify. And Paige and I let it go, because we already had everything that mattered. He went to trial for what he did to Corinne Ashby's father, and to 2 other elderly people in Billings who came forward once they knew they weren't alone. That's the only reason they came forward, because they found out they weren't the only fool. That's how much shame was holding the whole thing together. He got 6 years. I sat in that courtroom next to Corinne Ashby, a woman I'd never laid eyes on until that morning, and when the sentence came down, neither of us said anything. She just put her hand on my forearm for a second and then took it back. Strangers, both of us. We were the only 2 people in that row. Paige writes to him. I don't have anything to say to him, and I've stopped believing that's a moral failure on my part. Some doors close, and the honest thing is to let them stay closed. His son, my great nephew, is named Miles. He's 14 now. He lives with his mother, Renee, in Coeur d'Alene. I send him a card on his birthday and a check at Christmas, and Renee sends back a thank you note in her own handwriting every single time, which tells you what kind of woman she is. I don't expect a thing from that boy. He's not going to grow up calling me. But I want it on the record somewhere in his life that somebody in his father's family thought about him kindly and asked for nothing. That's the check I'm still paying on the thing I didn't ask Nolan when he was 16. About a year after the trial, Paige and I started something. We didn't call it a foundation. We didn't call it anything, honestly, because naming it would have made it sound bigger than it is. She set up a monthly hour through her church in Eugene. I set one up through a senior center about 1.5 miles from my house in Flagstaff. We go in, we sit down, and we tell this story. We tell Adeline Whitcomb's story too, with her daughter's permission, which she gave me over the phone in about 4 seconds flat. And then she cried for a while, and then she told me some things about her mother I'm not going to repeat here. And then we stop talking, and we listen. You would not believe the things people tell you when you sit down and actually listen. Or maybe you would. I have heard my own story, with the names changed, from something like 40 different people in the last 2 years. 40, in 2 little rooms in 2 small towns, a son who needs just one signature, a grandson who's been helping with the accounts, a daughter who knows just the right fellow to set up a trust. And you only have to come into the office the one time. Someone who needs it done today, this afternoon. Before the notary leaves, before mom wakes up, before dad passes. It happens every day. In every state. To people who balance their checkbooks every Sunday morning at the same table with the same pen. I've thought a great deal in the years since about what kind of man I was before Adeline Whitcomb stopped me in that hallway. And I've come to some conclusions I want to hand you, because they're all I've got and they cost me my brother's last hours to learn. The first one is this. I had built my entire life on an assumption I never once examined, which was that the people who shared my blood would never be the people I needed to protect myself from. I thought that assumption was loyalty. It wasn't loyalty. Loyalty is something you do. That was just a wall I'd built so I'd never have to look at anything. And what I understand now is that being a decent person is not about loving the people you're supposed to love. Anybody can do that. That's the easy half, and we hand out medals for it. It's about being honest enough to see them clearly, smart enough to ask the question that hurts to ask, and tough enough to act on the answer when it comes back. And it's not the answer you wanted. That's the work. Nobody teaches it. It isn't natural. It has to be practiced, and most of us practice the opposite our whole lives and call it being nice. The second thing is about that phrase. It's not my place. I've now heard it from a nurse in Missoula who had a bad feeling for 6 weeks. I've heard it from a sister-in-law in a letter from a dead woman. I've heard it in my own voice, in my own kitchen, about a buddy whose grown daughter was plainly lying about where his money went, about a neighbor whose son moved back in and started helping with the bills, and then started helping with the accounts. Things I saw, things I chose not to see, and then filed the choosing under manners. So let me put it as plainly as I know how. The cost of saying something and being wrong is a little awkwardness. An uncomfortable dinner. A cousin who's short with you at a funeral. That's the whole bill. You will pay it and you will live. The cost of saying nothing and being right is somebody's entire life. Those two things are not close. They're not on the same continent, and we spend our whole lives choosing the second one because the first one makes us feel rude for an evening. The third thing is the practical one. And if you take one thing from an old man's voice today, take this. When somebody is rushing you, slow down. That's it. That's the entire defense. Rushing you is the tell. It is always the tell. Legitimate business can wait until Tuesday. There has never once in the history of this world been an honest piece of paper that had to be signed tonight before the notary got in his car. So, take the paper home. Take a photograph of every page of it. Read the pages underneath the top page, my God. Read the pages underneath the top page. Call somebody who has nothing to gain from your decision, not the person who brought you the paper. Somebody with nothing to gain. The people who love you will wait a day. The people who don't won't. And the fourth thing is Adeline. I never knew that woman. We spoke twice. She gave me 1 note and 1 minute of her last week alive. And she is family to me in a way that some of my own blood never managed. I've decided that family is not the people you're issued at birth. Family is who shows up. Family is who tells you the truth when the truth costs them everything and gains them nothing, when they have, in the literal sense, nothing left to give but that. She could have kept quiet. She had every excuse a human being has ever had. She was dying. She was alone. She'd been failed by her own son and abandoned by her own people, and she owed the world exactly nothing. And she spent one of the last coins she had on a stranger, walking past her door at 2 in the morning. That's the whole sermon. That's everything I have. One dying woman decided her silence was worth less than a stranger's whole life. And because of that, my brother's last wishes are intact. My niece has her father's insurance. 3 old people in Billings got something back, and I am a man who can shave in front of a mirror. The size of a thing has nothing to do with how far it travels. I drive past that hospice, sometimes when I'm up in Montana visiting Paige and the kids. It's still there, still smells like lavender from the parking lot. Adeline Whitcomb's room faced the road, and I look up at that window every single time, and I have never once driven past without slowing down. I keep her letter folded in the drawer of my nightstand. I take it out and read it maybe 6 times a year. I don't know how many I've got left, so if this meant anything to you, leave a comment below and tell me about the person in your life who told you the truth when nobody else would. Tell me who your Adeline was. And if you don't have one, if nobody ever stopped you in the hallway, then I'd ask you to consider being one for somebody else. Because there is a person in your life right now who is walking past your open door. And you have seen something, and you have been telling yourself it isn't your place. It might be your place. It might be the only place that matters this week. If somebody is pushing you to sign a paper today, right now, before something happens, please hear an old dispatcher out. Don't sign it tonight. Drive home if you can. The truth will still be there in the morning. And so will the people who actually love you. Thank you for staying with me. Take care of yourselves out there, and listen to the strangers in the hallway. Sometimes they're the only ones telling you the truth. Every line of this story was written by a human being, thought through at a kitchen table, argued with, crossed out, and written again. The names have been changed and some details reshaped to protect people who are still living and one who isn't. But the reasoning, the memory, the judgments and the failures of judgment, the shame of the $11,000 and the years of not asking, those are mine. I put them here on purpose because a story about the cost of not saying the hard thing would be worth nothing at all if I weren't willing to say the hard thing about myself. Thank you for listening. Truly.